Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor as always, and I'm here to bring you my review of Traveler, the Spiral Path, which is a World of Warcraft supposedly children's book, which is the second part of the Traveler series. It is not, as I thought it would be, it is not the final part of the series, it is just the continuation of the previous book. Uh, how am I going to break up this video? First off, I'm going to talk about my general impressions of the book, which will be a completely spoiler-free section. And then I'm going to talk about the new little bits of information we find out about the lore of World of Warcraft in general, which is to say not specifically related to the story. And then I'm going to give an in-depth analysis of the book, pretty much walking through its story and what I thought of it at various intervals. So I'm going to start off by saying that if in order to read this book, you really do need to read the first one. This second book does start the first few chapters as a sort of recap, which do continue the story but also say, hey, this is what happened in the previous book, but they're really intended much more to be a sort of reminder for people like me who read the book a longer time ago and know what happens, but maybe not, they don't remember off the top of their head, and they're not really intended for people who are new to the series. So I would definitely recommend that you would start with the first book if this review makes you interested in the series. I would say I've heard after I did my review for the first book in the series, which I'm going to link in the description below. I've heard a response from a few friends of mine that have picked up the book as a result of my recommendation of it, that said they didn't like certain aspects of certain characters, specifically the main character. I have to say, in this particular book, those characters with which they had problems, they do develop, so to say, and lose most of those unpleasant characteristics those people I talked to found. But again, it's mostly a result of character development, and you should read the first book in order to see where that character development comes from. And I have to say, even if you would find certain traits of those characters deplorable, I think they do wind up in a very sympathetic manner in this second book. I also really like that this second book really developed the villains as opposed to the first one. The first one was the story of the main characters. I guess I could say. But this one treats the whole thing as more of an ensemble cast. It focuses a lot more attention on the other characters which travel in the main character's party, which really turns the book not just from a one or two centered piece to an ensemble cast, I guess you could say. And it also really develops the characters of the villains. We see their perspective at a lot of times, except for the main villain, to be fair. He only appears at certain times in order to keep him more mysterious. And like I said, all of the villains are developed, and they really turn them into interesting people. You really do sympathize with those villains, even if it is a children's book, and a children's book might make you say, oh, the villains will obviously be one-dimensional or whatever. Now, I would say the first Traveler book left me really invested in the story, so I automatically picked up the second one when it came out. But I don't know if a new reader would really care about the story. I would also say, in regards to what I mentioned in my first review, I'm not sure if this book is really intended for children, since it contains quite a bit of violence. There is still violence here, but there isn't. Interestingly enough, there is no mention of blood or gore or whatever, even though people get stabbed, people get decapitated, skeletons appear and such, but there is no mention of blood. So, I guess that makes it okay for children. I'm really not sure how exactly those things work, but I guess any parents listening to this video might decide for themselves based on what I say if it is worth for their children. But I will say, this book really feels much more like it's a simple story written for someone who has played the game, who might be a younger player of the game, but it really seems to be intended for someone, again, who is a bit familiar with the universe and who has played the game, and it's even more of a bonus if they know expanded universe lore, although not a major bonus. It's a standalone book and you can treat it as such. So it's a children's book, but it's for children who are fans of the Warcraft universe. Unless their parents are also fans of the Warcraft universe and they read it along with their children and they can sort of explain whatever happens. Anyway, I will also say that this second book also feels really consistent with the first one, which is to say, it feels like a natural continuation of the first one. It doesn't feel like there is a certain break off. I could finish reading the first one and then start the second one without feeling like there's any interruption, unless you count the a bit extended exposition which happens in the first few chapters as a sort of recap. It is a very wholesome, I guess you could say, book. It involves a lot of solving your problems not through violence, although violence does happen and is a solution, I guess, but solving your problems through other, sometimes more creative, sometimes just more peaceful ways. I will also say that it feels very Warcrafty. Like I said, it seems to be intended for people who are familiar with the universe, and there are a lot of things which only makes sense to people who would really know the lore, and it fits really well into the story of Warcraft. And what I also really appreciated is that it really is kind of a story, a Warcraft story told from a common man's perspective. We don't see the grand heroics of Thrall or of Ronin or whoever else. It's a story told from a common man thrust into a very uncommon situation, to be fair, but it really shows their perspective on the various things they encounter. It shows a little bit, or more tangentially, but it is there, of how they would think about events in the larger world. How it shows how much they would know about stuff happening in the larger world again. And I really like it because of this, because it provides an entirely different perspective compared to what we have now, since what we have now, both in the game and in the expanded universe, with the exception of maybe the starting zones or whatever, are really the heroic tales of main characters, and this is really the way to experience the story as told from the point of view of people, of civilians, so to say. So in conclusion, as a sort of conclusion of my general spoiler-free impressions, what do I think of this? I really liked it. I would definitely recommend it for people who have read and enjoyed the first book, and I would also recommend it for people who have read the first book and maybe didn't enjoy it as much, because first off, there are the flaws of the main characters get sorted through, so to say. The story turns more and more interesting for the most part, and it also adopts a few interesting artistic shifts, so to say, which is to say, The first book was written almost entirely from a sort of objective or sometimes from the point of view of the two main human characters, while this book also contains a few chapters and portions of chapters written from the points of view of various other people. There's several from the points of view of a sand troll, there's several from the points of view of a gnoll, some from the point of view of a murloc, a lot from the point of view of ogres, and you can really also see the thought process of these particular people as imagined by the author, which I think did a really good job when it comes to that. So yeah, Travel Volume 2, if you've read Volume 1, I would definitely recommend it. If you haven't, first off, go watch my review of Volume 1 and decide based on that if you would like to buy Volume 1. Admittedly, it is a lot cheaper than a lot of the other Warcraft books, and it's a particularly good Warcraft book in my opinion. So next up, we're going to go a bit into spoiler territory. I'm not going to talk yet about the actual story itself. This is just this portion where I talk about bits of lore which are available to the entire Warcraft universe, which we discover in this new book. Naturally, it might contain a few unintentional, perhaps, spoilers. The intention is obviously not to talk about the story yet, but inevitably little tidbits will be connected. These little tidbits will be connected to the story of the novel itself. So going through it sort of a chronological order, in the order we find them out. First off, apparently ogre meat is extremely rancid, yet but the meat of yetis is pretty good and tastes like bear. Gnolls are organized in matriarchal societies, and each matriarch has a brute which is basically their mate. If there is no matriarch which is considered fitting to lead the tribe, then the brute will lead the tribe until usually his daughter becomes the new matriarch. And also in general, gnoll females tend to be larger than males. Also, gnolls can and do eat other gnolls, pretty much no issues there. Next up, ogres are an ecological disaster wherever they go. This is not really a new piece of information. You can just look at Zangar Marsh or at pretty much every other ogre village in Azeroth. But in this particular book, we discovered that they've pretty much ruined the entire ecosystem of Eastern Faerlas after they've settled in the Dire Maul. So there you go. Yetis have their own sort of societies, their own language, and even a belief in their afterlife. In an afterlife, rather. They know their immediate neighbors, obviously, and they also, for the most part, know what elves are. They don't really usually know what humans are, though. Also, pretty much everyone knows about Deathwing because of the Cataclysm. This book is set after the Cataclysm, probably after the discovery of Pandaria, although I am not entirely sure about that, but I'll talk about that later when we get into the story discussion, I guess you could say. Gnolls also can cook their meat raw, or they can eat it in chili, which is interesting. And a specialty of the gnomes is the dragon breath chili, which literally sets your mouth on fire, which is a thing. Next up, we learn a little bit about the life cycle of Dryads, which you meet, namely the daughters of Cenarius, which is to say they are presumably born from Cenarius somehow in the form of an acorn, and the acorn is nurtured by a druid. If the acorn gets wet, a dryad sort of hatches from it, and the dryad immediately imprints on the first living thing it sees and becomes attached, sort of a companion to said living thing. Usually it has to be a person, not a plant or whatever else. And usually these acorns are hatched in the presence of a druid, so that the druid can become a companion of the dryad and can help the dryad learn her the abilities which are inherent to her race, I guess you could say. The dryads also view their life cycle as a sort of seasons. For example, if you would ask a freshly hatched dryad what season it is, that dryad would say it is spring, because she has just been born and she's in the infancy, so to say, of her life, although her personality doesn't necessarily change as they go on. Their powers awaken during summer, they start growing old during fall, and so on and so forth. And these seasons are more of metaphors, they don't actually represent the seasons which are outside in the living world, so to say. Next up, you remember Freewind Post, which is the one Tauren outpost in Thousand Needles, which was taken over in Cataclysm by the Grim Totem. Well, the Tauren do get it back with the aid of the Quillbore, which is weird. The Quillbore of Razorfen Downs, specifically. And now Freewind Post is a sort of mixed settlement of Tauren and Quillbore, and the two communities are mediated by a High of Magistrix, which keeps the peace between the two communities. Next up, we learned that SI7, the Stormwind Intelligence Agency, existed even before World of Warcraft, and they had agents in Lordaeron before the Scourge came. We also learn a little bit about how sort of Sylvanas treats the identity of the Forsaken, namely, newly raised Forsaken, she demands their loyalty, but she does not keep them enthralled. So if a Forsaken would want to leave, she would be upset about it, but she would let them go. This happens even if said Forsaken is one of which has particular talents, which is the case of one of the characters. But when she lets them go, she basically tells them, the world is not going to accept you for who you are. We are the only ones who will accept you who we are, but if you want to go, you're free to go. Next up, we learn that Quillbore can and do regularly get drunk. And then we learn that Razorfen Downs, you know about Razorfen Downs, how the Quillbore there, because they were threatened by the Horde and such, traded the Downs to the Scourge in order for some temporary power. Where we learned that it was not actually Chargra Razorflank, which was the Quillbore leader up until Cataclysm, if I'm not mistaken, but we learned that it is her presumed daughter, which is Chugara Razorflank, and she is the one who invited the Death's Head over to Razorfen Downs. And we learned that actually in this is the story where Razorfen Downs gets dealt with, because one of the villains actually, defeats the Scourge in Razorfen Downs, which is cool. We also learned that Blackthorn, the Quillbore boss in Razorfen Downs, his farts literally smell of death, and I have nothing to add to that. We also learned that Chugara Razorflank, the Quillbore lady who invited the Scourge over to Razorfen Downs, entered into a sort of alliance with the Ogres of Dire Maul. Namely, she built their prison pens, which were made out of the spiny stuff that the Razorfen places are made of, and as an exchange, the ogres would give them prisoners, which the Quillbore would sacrifice to the Scourge. There you go. We also learn a little bit more about the value of money, which is to say, 1 gold means a lot for the common people of Azeroth, and even 1 copper is a decent amount sum, because with only 1 copper you can apparently buy a handful of vegetables, which isn't exactly little. Although rich entrepreneurs like Gazlo and pirates tend to have thousands of gold in their cargo. We also learn a little bit about why the Bloodsail Buccaneers and the Blackwater Raiders have their little rivalry, which is also a sort of ideological rivalry, I guess you could say. Namely, the Bloodsail Buccaneers, they kill everyone they catch. Whenever they plunder, they kill everyone. While the Blackwater Raiders, if the people they rob surrender, they do not kill anyone. So typically the Blackwater Raiders tend to be richer because people are more willing to surrender to them, but the Bloodsail Buccaneers are more feared, and this sort of leads to a competition between the two. Next up, we learn that Zul'Farrak, at least in its last few years in Cataclysm, had a population of about a few hundred trolls, most likely less than 1,000. We also learn that the Sand Fury are not protected by... they have their own Loa of Death, I would rather say, which we already kind of knew, namely because we knew from a dungeon journal about a specific Sand Troll boss in Zul'Farrak, whose name I can't remember, that Bwansamdi, the Trollo of the Dead, of all Troll Dead, does not protect the Sand Fury. But now we know that the Sand Fury actually have their own god, which protects them from death, which I will write somewhere on the screen because I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. We also learn that, and I'm not sure how to say this, but Gazlo, the goblin, had an affair with Noggenfogger's wife. Well, had the affair before she married Noggenfogger, but they still fancy each other, I guess you could say. Next up, we visit Gadgetzan, and rest assured, people who hate how Hearthstone has treated the lore of Warcraft, Gadgetzan is not portrayed as it is in Hearthstone. Namely, those 3 gangs do not appear, they're not even mentioned. Gadgetzan is called a city, and it is portrayed as having many alleys and many streets, but it is not a bustling, massive city, and it is not split between those rival gangs which are mentioned in Hearthstone. And lastly, we learn of the purpose of the Thunderdome in the middle of Gadgetzan. It's technically not supposed to be for Roman arena style gladiatorial matches, but rather it's a place where, because people are not allowed to fight each other in Gadgetzan, people who have something to fight about go to the arena, announce they're about to fight, and people put wagers on them. And it's also a sort of way to keep public order in Gadgetzan, because fights make people happy, I guess. Now I'm going to talk about a detailed sort of walkthrough through the story of Traveler, without going into really too much depth, and sort of present my opinions on what happens. Obviously, from now on, full spoilers ahead, but also I will say that this part of the video is intended for people who know what happened in the first part. I'm not going to recap the first part because that would really take too much time. Go watch my review, or better yet, read the book, because it's a good book. But anyway, we begin this story with immediately after what happened the last time, namely the main character's party, which is Aramar Thorn, the boy, Mikasa Flintwill, the girl, and No and a Murloc, and their now deceased druid who they buried at the end of the last book. They continue on their route to Gadgetzan. Now the book starts in a really touching way, I guess, and it's also one of the biggest developments the 2 main characters get in this book, because much of the book will be focused on the ensemble cast rather than on the 2 of them like the previous book was. which is Aramar, who, as you may recall, likes to sketch things. In fact, his sketches make up part of the book, part of the physical book, that is. He sketches Mikasa, which up until that point refused to be drawn by him, and it's a little touching scene. I will also mention, again, this is pretty much most of the character development the two get. Mikasa has a little side plot of how she, as the party grows bigger and bigger, she remembers that, oh, I need to go alone, I can't depend on all of these people, but she eventually learns, hey, these people are not that bad, I can depend on them, they're my crew, basically. And Aramar doesn't really develop. He in many ways stays the same person, but his actions influence the story in a very positive way, I think you could say. And the party again is composed, besides the two of them, of the No Hako, which they liberated from Dire Maul after being imprisoned by the Gorduni ogres, and the Murloc Murky. Yes, I am not kidding. And now they are continuing on their route to Gadgetzan, like I said, where they intend to book passage to the Eastern Kingdoms for Aramar to return home. They are pursued by the villains, which are the so-called Hidden, whose leader, Malice, is now the new king of the ogres. And Malice orders every single ogre to leave Dire Maul to go after the escapees. And in Malice's original party there was also another ogre named Frog of the Shattered Hand clan, which is weird enough in its own right. And he is a self-described traditionalist. He does not like when ogre customs are breached, which is exactly what is happening when Malice orders all of the other ogres to leave Dire Maul. And this is one of the moments where we get insight into the villains. We get Frog's displeasure at Malice doing what he does. We get Malice's attempts to maintain Frog's loyalty, and we get Frog getting a crush on a female ogre, which is cool, I guess. And then we move on. The villains split their forces into 3 search parties in order to find the magical compass, which Aramar carries, which is related to the light, quite literally. It is very likely a shard of a Naru, perhaps, but we don't we know the story of that particular shard develops, but I will get to it when it is relevant, I guess. So the villains split their team into 3. One is the Whisper Man, who is a Forsaken, and he is actually because of this book, he is one of my favorite characters in Warcraft lore. We get finally his development, his story. He was a special agent of Varian Rin, a personal friend of Varian Rin. In fact, Varian personally granted him the title of Baron, and he was attached to SI7 agents in Lordaeron. And obviously the plague came and he became undead, and he was eventually liberated by Sylvanas, but eventually decided to go on his own and become a mercenary. And he is very melancholic about his state. He constantly douses himself in perfume in jasmine to not smell like a dead person, and his most fond memory is one of his former lovers while he was alive kissing him on his undead cheek, which is kind of touching, and I honestly did not expect that. But I also liked how he sort of deals with his depression, which is he is amused at pretty much everything and pokes fun at pretty much everyone. For example, one of my absolute favorite moments, I think the funniest moment I've ever seen in all of Warcraft, is towards the end of the book. Mikasa lures most of the villains into the Thunderdome of Gadgetzan in order to have a public duel of them and hopefully defeat them and probably kill them. In order to sort of justify this duel, she just blurts out, "These people stole my cheese," and all of the villains look at her confusedly, except for the Baron, who yells, "We will never give you back your cheese." And the fight starts obviously, and when asked, "Hey, now that you're defeated, are you going to give them back their cheese?" "We will never give you back your cheese." But the Baron is also very heroic. Like I mentioned, Razorfen Downs appears in the story. At one point the party goes to Razorfen Downs, I'll get to why later, and the Baron obviously goes after them, not knowing what he will find in the Razorfen Downs. And he eventually stumbles upon them, and he also stumbles upon Blackthorn trying to resurrect the Lich Amnanar the Coldbringer. And this is the moment when this Forsaken goes all serious. He forgets all of his jokes and decides the compass, the people he's chasing are not that important. I have to stop the Scourge from gaining another foothold on Azeroth. And he single-handedly defeats the undead Quillboars of Razorfen Downs and prevents the Scourge from gaining a foothold on Kalimdor, which is an unexpectedly heroic moment from this character, which again I really did not expect. But anyway, the second party is led by Frog, and he is accompanied by 5 or 6 ogres whose names are not important, except the female ogre who accompanies him, which he has a crush on, and who is actually the brains of his little group. We get a little bit of Frog's backstory as well, and we find out that he was a member of an ogre clan in the Second War, probably during the Beyond the Dark portal, although it's never stated out loud, which was ambushed by the Alliance, and he was the last survivor of said clan. And as he was fighting the Alliance and being on the verge of being killed by this Alliance troop, the Shattered Hand clan came in and saved Frog and took Frog in as one of their own. Eventually, though, most of Frog's friends in the Shattered Hand died, and these orc survivors of the Shattered Hand, our Shattered Hand again, all pretty much hated Frog. But Frog was loyal to the oath he swore to the Shattered Hand, and so he never left. And this is one of the main characteristics of Frog, that he is, again, a traditionalist, so to say, and he really respects the value of an oath and what an oath means. And then the main villain shows up, Malice, the leader of the Hidden, and he notices Frog, and Frog notices him, and they both size each other up, and they see how strong warriors the other is, and they find that they can respect each other. And Malice goes to the leader of the Shattered Hand and says, "I'll buy him for 30 silver." And the leader of the Shattered Hand gives Frog away for 30 silver, which obviously crushes Frog's heart, but now he finally has a friend again, so he has something to be loyal to, I guess you could say. We also learned that the Shattered Hand was working with the Hidden, which are the villains of the story. I'm not sure why, but we later learn, and this is one of the biggest reveals, that the Hidden is working for the Burning Legion. So the Shattered Hand indirectly are also working for the Burning Legion, which I honestly did not see coming. Anyway, the third search party is led by the Sand Troll Zul'Farrak, who we find out is very superstitious. and she constantly makes sacrifices to the Loa, and her main goal is not to capture the compass, but to capture the Aramar and his party and take them to Zul'Farrak and sacrifice them there, because Zul'Farrak hasn't had a good sacrifice in a long time. And I'm not joking. And she's accompanied by 2 ogres who are obviously pretty dumb, and she's the main brains and the leader. And it's interesting, and this is the main point where her development happens. She eventually captures the party and takes them to Zul'Farrak to be sacrificed by the Loa. And we find that the chief sand sculpt of the Zul'Farrak is alive, and he prepares to sacrifice them. And all of Zul'Farrak is gathered for this massive ceremony. The sky darkens, and 3 Loa show up. The Law of the Beasts, the Law of the Spiders, and the Law of the Dead, the Sand Fury Law of the Dead. And something incredible happens. The Law of the Beasts respects the party for their strength and refuses to partake in the sacrifice. The Law of the Spiders is scared of one member of the party. I will mention the party extends by 1 member, and I'll talk about her when we get to her. And the Law of the Spiders is scared of her. And the final Law, the Law of Death, refuses to partake in the sacrifice because the party will eventually have another reckoning with them. He says that. And after said reckoning, if the party loses, that specific Law of the Dead will consume all of Azeroth. I guess we have another Hakar wannabe. Anyway, what is relevant to Zafra, the Sand Fury Troll's character, is that after this unprecedented event where the Loa actually refused to partake in the sacrifices the Sand Fury brought them, all of Zul'Farrak is basically stunned. They basically stare dumbfounded at Aramar and his party, and the main characters just sort of leave Zul'Farrak unopposed. And Zafra is stunned for a few moments, and then she leaves. She recovers her ogres and says, we never found Aramar. I don't know what happened, but I'm scared for the life of me, and I don't know if the Loa say that they are not to be sacrificed. Should I not be fighting them? I'm confused. And later on, she fights much of the party in the Thunderdome, as I mentioned, and she is scared there, and it is one of the reasons why she is defeated in that particular encounter. And the last members of the villainous party are Malice and his Arakoa, Sarbik, who travel to Outland, which is the sort of headquarters of the Hidden. And there we meet the main villain and the main leader of the Hidden, which I honestly was really disappointed by. Many of the signs pointed it to being the sort of absent old god of Draenor that we got so many hints of during Burning Crusade and a few during Warlords of Draenor. But no, it's just a Burning Legion Dreadlord. Until the last chapter, unnamed Burning Legion Dreadlord, and the name he has is Zanak or something like that, it's not a character we have met previously, which was honestly really disappointing. I mean, a Burning Legion Dreadlord is a big deal in universe, but it's not that big of a deal compared to the old god of Draenor. But whatever, it is what it is. With this occasion, we also find out that the Burning Legion still has outposts in Outland, which it uses. We also learned that the Arakoa who was with Malice's party has a sister who is smarter than him, and the brother and the sister can teleport to and from each other, and they use this ability to teleport to Outland and later to teleport to Malice's ship, where they travel to Gadgetzan in order to sort of cut Aramar and his party off. But so that's what happens with the villains, and again, their story is really well developed, and I really quite like that. So, what happens with the protagonists? Well, they travel from the edge of Fairloss with Thousand Needles, and they cross into the territory of the Woodpaw Gnolls. And the Gnolls have been driven from their territory by the Eddies, who were driven from their territory by the Ogres. And as you may remember, the party also has a gnoll named Hako, who was a member of the Woodpaw clan. And we learn why Hako was exiled from the clan, namely because he spoke up when the gnolls were being driven by the Eddies, saying, look, Hako was basically saying, look, something is driving the Eddies and it's probably ogres, and nobody believed him. And eventually many of his friends turned against him, and one of his friends turned enemies became chieftain. He became Brute, and said Brute exiled Hako, and Hako was only allowed to return if he returned with the head of the leader of the Eddies. And eventually the party stumbles into Gnoll territory. They are momentarily captured by the Gnolls, and said Gnoll leader says, if you can kill the Yeti leader and bring him to me, then Hako is allowed to return to the clan. And as a sort of insurance, the Gnoll leader sends his young daughter to keep watch over them. And I have to say, the daughter of the Gnoll leader is probably one of the cutest people in the whole book. But anyway, long story short, they don't kill the Yeti leaders. Instead, they make an alliance with the Yetis against the ogres. They kill an ogre party, and they return with the Yetis to the Gnoll village, and the Gnolls make an alliance with the Yetis, and a big celebration feast happens, and everyone leaves happy. Hako reconciles with his old friends, etc. Then the party moves on, and they travel to New Falanar, only to find it besieged by the Grim Totems. So they continue traveling across the shore of Thousand Needles, the now flooded Thousand Needles. Accidentally, however, I may have forgotten to mention that the druid from the previous book, before he died, gave Aramar an acorn, and he warned that the acorn should not get wet. If you have heard the first part of this video, then you might guess what happens. Yes, the acorn gets wet, and a dryad hatches from it, and her name is Farandrella, short form Drella, and she is extremely lovely and extremely naive and extremely egotistical, but extremely nice. She is really quite a nice character, I guess, and she sometimes gets them into situations they shouldn't. For instance, she yells, "But I want to see the Tauren," which draws the attention of Grim Totem patrols who try to kill them. But all in all, she's a very nice addition to the story. She brings a lot of flavor, I guess you could say. And she is the character that scared the Loa of the spiders, the troll of the spiders, by basically going on a gigantic "I am a daughter of Cenarius and I do not belong to you," and the Loa of the spiders just skidded away scared. Which I honestly did not see coming, but there you go. Anyway, they eventually stumble across a Knight of Patrol who almost kills them until they see the Dryad, and then they immediately bow down reverently and they give them a boat, and eventually they traveled via boat to Freewind Post. I described what Freewind Post looks like. That is now a Tauren and Quilboar mixed town. Only the town is regularly attacked by harpies, and during one such attack, one of the Quilboars kidnaps the Dryad and takes her to Razorfen Downs, hoping that she could cleanse the undead corruption of the Razorfen Downs. She obviously cannot, because she is only a newly born Dryad, so to say, and the undead Quilboar capture her and prepare to sacrifice her to the Lich Amnenar the Coldbringer. And it's So again, it's a moment where we see, and it's quite interesting, the Dryad's perspective on everything that happens. We see her sort of shiver in fear and be extremely distressed at what happens to Razorfen Downs, not because of the horrors that go down there, but because of how unnatural it is, and undeath decay is the opposite of life, of what she represents. And at one point, the main party comes to rescue her, and at one point they fight Traga Razorflank, and she prepares to make the thorns of Razorfen Downs grow instantaneously to kill the intruders. Only the Dryad catches Razorflank and says, "Stop, can't you see that they're hurting?" And she makes the Quillboar feel how the thorns are hurting. And the Quillboar drops down to her knees and starts crying. And obviously the spell stops, and they manage to escape. And what happens at Razorfen Downs with the Undead Forsaken happens. Then they move on and go to Physic and Posic Speed Barge, where they participate in a race, in a speed barge race held by none other, well, sponsored by none other than Gazlowe. They take part in Gazlowe's team because they need to salvage a piece of the crystal they've been looking for from the bottom of the Shimmering Flats, and Gazlowe is the only one who has salvage equipment. And Gazlowe is willing to help them, provided that Aramar becomes his pilot for the race, because his current pilot is a leper gnome whose suit is too heavy. And I also mentioned that I found quite funny that Drella is horrified by the leper gnome, by how unnatural he is, by how diseased he is, and she actually starts crying. But she makes several tentative attempts to sort of warm up to him. She starts on her own, sort of walking up to him before running away in terror. It's really kind of funny. But anyway, Aramar eventually wins the race, but not before being discovered by the ogre group of the party. But they escape, they salvage the crystal piece, and they trick the ogres and move on to Gadgetzan. Before they get to Gadgetzan, they get captured by Zafra and her two ogres, and the whole Zul'Farrak story happens. And then I'm skipping over a lot of things, but long story short, they reach Gadgetzan, they meet Gazlowe there, and they search for another piece of the crystal. Gadgetzan is infested by Malice and his men. And in Gadgetzan, again, they meet Gazlowe, and Gazlowe has grown fond of the party, and because Gazlowe still owes them a bit of money because of Aramar's fee as a pilot for his winning speedboat, he plays nice to them. He buys them things out of said money he owes, and he also sort of misdirects Malice's various troops, although they eventually discover the party, and he brings the druid that they were supposed to bring the seed, the acorn, which eventually grew into a dryad too. And the druid tells them, well, she grew into a dryad, she can no longer bond with me, you need to take her to Stone Talon, and there she needs to meet up with a druid who can sever the bond between Aramar and her, and who can then train her. The Dryad doesn't really care where she goes. She's just content going where Aramar goes. But the Druid tells them, look, it's not bad if she doesn't learn, but it'll be pretty much wasted potential. So Aramar eventually decides, hey, rather than being selfish and going home, let's go to Stone Talon, because to help our friend. And this is also where the title of the book comes in, The Spiral Path, because it is in reference to, and it is explained that it refers to not taking the direct route in order to help your friends. That is the main idea behind it. Anyway, before moving on though, and before the conflict with Malus and his troops happens, the Mikasa and Aramar meet up with a goblin, a cousin of Gazlo, who also worked on the speed barge, but he happened to be in Gadgetzan, who drew one of the books that Aramar's father had. And the two obviously compare notes, and they realize that the goblin was a close friend of their father. And the goblin also mentions that their father had a brother. So Aramar and Mikasa have a sort of uncle. We don't know who said uncle is. I imagine it's possible that it may be the main villain. It could be one of those twists, but we don't know. But again, that will probably be explained in part 3 whenever that may come out. Anyway, a confrontation with Malus's troops happens. They are discovered accidentally. Mikasa leads most of them to the Thunderdome, and there it's a 4-on-4 match between Malus's party versus the main group minus Aramar. Aramar finds another piece of the shard of the crystal, and the crystal forms into the hilt of a sword, which obviously surprises everyone. And eventually Aramar is found by Malus and his two Arakoa. The two Arakoa weave a spell to trap Malus and prepare to take the compass from him. But Aramar suddenly pulls out the hilt of the crystal, and it turns into a sword of light, which cuts off the magic of the Arakoa, which instantly knocks them unconscious. And then the pure voice of the light speaks down on the main villain and chastises him, and the main villain is left curling up his knees and pretty much incapacitated for a while Aramar makes his escape. I should also mention that throughout the story, Aramar has various dreams of an entity of the light which he has to find, which was present in the previous book. It's what the compass that everyone is seeking leads him to. But throughout his dreams, Malus has been starting to show up, and Malus is constantly saying, "Don't trust the light. It will only betray you," and so on and so forth. But obviously, Aramar is not going to betray the light because it's a children's book, and the main characters have to be positive, and that's what happens. And eventually, Mikasa wins her match in the Thunderdome. Nobody dies, and they all board the Zeppelin and head to Stone Talon. Malus and his goons don't know where they went, so they threaten Mayor Noggenfogger to tell them where they went, and Noggenfogger is intimidated and tells them, hey, they boarded the ship and went to Stormwind. And that's pretty much where the book ends. Malus thinks the party went to Stormwind when they actually went to Stone Talon, and the continuation will be in part 3. There's one little extra chapter at the end where we discover that the Lord of the Hidden, the Dreadlord of the Burning Legion, has kept Aramar's father, Greydornthorn, captive, and has been torturing him for the past few months to reveal information. And it's a big reveal because it's been a question of, well, did he survive? Is he captured, or is he dead up until now? And now we know, yes, he's just captured, although he's in the care of a Dreadlord. So yeah, I guess this is a detailed walkthrough of the story of the Spiral Path, and my opinions on it. I guess you can pretty much infer from what I said what I think of the book. Again, you should go purchase it. It's cheap compared with other Warcraft books. Yeah, thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you all later. Goodbye.